Hey guys, so today I am going to be doing a video talking all about how I got into reading. I've seen a lot of booktubers doing this type of video recently and I actually thought it was really interesting. I get a lot of questions about this, like when and how did I get into reading, what age was I, what brought me to this point in my life where basically all I do is read. A lot of you guys have asked me questions like that, so I figured that I would do this type of video kind of explaining my whole progression of reading throughout my lifetime and how I've gotten to this place today, and I thought that would just kind of be fun and interesting, and if you're interested to see how I got into reading, then just keep on watching. I have to say, I've seen lots of booktubers do videos on this topic, and compared to the average booktube Harry Potter lover, my story is a little bit unconventional in comparison. As most of you probably know, I did not grow up reading Harry Potter like the average book lover. I sort of feel like that's how everybody started reading, is they started reading Harry Potter and then they were super into that, so then they just kind of moved on and continued to read more and more and more. But that is not the case with me. I never read Harry Potter, I still have not to this day, and yeah, I mean, my story is a little bit different. I have to be honest in saying that I don't think I really grew up with that kind of bookworm reader stereotype. Like, I was interested in reading, but I didn't dedicate like all of my time to reading as I do now. I don't think if you asked anybody that knew me as a young child, they would be like, oh yeah, Laura, she was always reading. Like, that really wasn't my thing until I got a little bit older. I did enjoy reading some books growing up though. I remember being really young, like first, second, third grade, and I was super into those like Mary-Kate and Ashley adventure books. There was like so many little like chapter books. We would do Dear. I don't know if you guys had that. It's like where you spend a little bit of time reading during the day, and I would always read those Mary-Kate and Ashley books, and I remember I also really liked like Judy Blume and just like all those like really cute little chapter books that people would read that age. And then when I got into like 5th grade, I remember being a huge fan of the How I Survived Middle School series by Nancy Krulik. That was like my favorite series. I had every single book. There was like 13 and I was obsessed with them and they were so cute, and I was like, oh my god, like middle school, because I wasn't in middle school yet, so I thought it was like super cool, like you're in middle school, oh my god. So yeah, I definitely really enjoyed those books, but I just kind of read those off and on again. I'd be like, Mom, get me the next book, and she'd be like, okay, but like it wasn't really a thing where I was just like super into reading, you know what I mean? I believe 5th or 6th grade is also when I discovered Twilight, and I was actually pretty early on that bandwagon. I remember hearing about the movie coming out, so I picked up the first book before it came out and I read that, and I ended up reading the whole series, and then I got to see all the movies, you know, before, because I read all the books before they had come out, and I remember just being obsessed with Twilight. Like, I was the biggest Twihard. I had like the Edward Cullen posters all over the wall. Like, I was like, I'm literally Bella, like Edward is mine. Like, I was obsessed with Twilight growing up. Twilight was like my Harry Potter. I was obsessed with it. So I did get really into Twilight, but I wouldn't say that was like also where I became a huge reader at all either. When I got into middle school, I read the Pretty Little Liars series, which I remember being super into, and I read the whole series. There was 8 books at the time. Now there's like 13 or something like that, but there was the 8 original books, and I would read those, and I would always read them really fast, like in one sitting. I can remember vividly being like, Mom, let's go to the bookstore, and she would take me like once a month, and I would pick out a couple books, and I was super into like Sarah Dessen and like, you know, cute contemporaries as I am now, YA books and all that kind of stuff, but also the Pretty Little Liars series. And I remember when I was in middle school, I would read these books, and I would finish them in one day. So I would sit down, grab a book, and finish it in one sitting, and everyone always thought that was super weird. Like, my mom was like, how are you doing this? Like, how do you read one book in a sitting? Like, that's so crazy. Like, who does that? And that's kind of where I started to realize that like I actually can like read pretty fast, and like I really do enjoy it, and so that kind of started that. But then again, not really the point where I say I would consider myself a reader. In 8th grade, my grandmother bought me The Fault in Our Stars and Looking for Alaska by John Green, and I read both of those books the week after she gave them to me. Like, I read Looking for Alaska and Tifios within the same week. Like, I must have hated myself and my life during that week, honestly. If you've read those books, you know. But I remember reading Looking for Alaska, and it was like the first book that I felt like such a connection to, and I just loved. And it was like one of the first books that I can remember being really emotionally attached to it, and it just made me have all the feels, and I loved it so much. And it was the first book that I was like, wow, and I felt like I was really touched by it. Freshman year of high school, I was super into One Direction, and I would always read One Direction fanfiction, and you know, it's not something I'm proud of, but I was obsessed with One Direction fanfiction, especially like Harry Styles fanfiction. That's how I found After when I was a freshman in high school. I read that book. A lot of you guys know that I'm a huge fan of After now, but what you probably don't know is that I was a huge fan of it when it was just the fanfiction, and I was just like everybody else, waiting for Anna to do updates every day on Wattpad. Like, I was obsessed with that. And I didn't really read books back then when I was a freshman, but I read fan fiction very regularly. And I actually remember this one day I was talking to my best friend McKenna, and she was also a big fan of After. I had made her read it, and then she became obsessed too. And she came up to me one day and she was like, hey Laura, like, you should check out this book. It's called Beautiful Disaster by Jamie Maguire, and it's so good. It kind of reminds me of After. You'd probably really like it. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll give it a try. I remember reading the synopsis of this book and being like, oh my god, I have to get my hands on this book. But I was so like young. I think I was like 14 years old. I didn't have a car at the time. I didn't have a license, which is like so weird to think about, that I couldn't just freely go to the bookstore like I do now. But anyway, so I remember I got it on my mom's Nook, and that's the only book I've ever read on a Nook. So I read it in like one sitting, and I remember being obsessed with it. And you guys know, like, Beautiful Disaster is one of my all-time favorites, and I just loved it so much. And I loved it so much that I decided to look up on YouTube like Beautiful Disaster and see what had come up, and it ended up that a book talk by Hannah came up. If you guys know Bookworms Talk with Hannah, she has a YouTube channel where she talks a lot about new adult books, and she had a book talk on this book, and I was like, what's a book talk? What's this? So I watched it and I was like, this is so fun. I get to like fangirl with her, and that is the first booktube video I have ever watched, which is also kind of like a fun fact. But I remember I read that, and I read that book I think like May or June of my freshman year, and I don't really remember reading a lot during that summer, but I remember going into sophomore year and I had this English class, and I think it was like American literature or something like that. But my teacher, I remember, told us that we were going to have this thing called SSR, which is, I believe, Silent Sustained Reading. And it's basically where a couple times a week she would let us just sit down for a whole class period and read whatever we wanted. And so me being me, I was like, oh, this is awesome, like, this is so cool. And I remember just being really excited about it. And I think the book that I read in that class, the first SSR book I read, was The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. And I remember reading it, and my teacher would come around during every SSR and kind of mark down what book we were reading and what page we were on, and so she could like come back the next time and see how far we've gone. And I remember we had our first SSR and I read The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and then I went home that day and I finished the book. So then the next week when we had SSR, she kind of came up to me and she's like, okay, what page are you on? And I was like, oh, well, I finished that book, so I'm starting this one. And she was like, you already finished a book? And I was like, yeah, I already finished a book. And she was like, oh, okay, like, that's awesome, so cool. So she gave me this like sticky note, and we had this big wall in our room where it was like, this class period read, and then you would put your sticky note of the book you read. And then I remember just being like, wow, like, this is kind of cool, like, I can have all these sticky notes up on the wall. So then I just kind of started challenging myself to read more and more books, and needless to say, at the end of the year, about 80% of that board ended up being books that I read. And my teacher loved me. I had her for the next year too when I was a junior, and she's my all-time favorite teacher that I think I've ever had. I think her having that SSR thing really did inspire me to read more books and kind of start off my reading game a little bit stronger. I'm also pretty sure that September of my sophomore year is when I put up my first booktube video, my first book haul, which you could look up on my channel if you want. It's probably really cringeworthy and awkward, but yeah, that's kind of where I started to get really into reading. So now I am almost graduating high school, and I am here reading so many books every single month and living for it, and yeah, it's really crazy. So truly, I didn't become a huge reader until a couple years ago. I obviously read off and on throughout my whole life. I never was one of those kids that despised reading, but honestly, it wasn't until more recently that I started reading a lot and actually considering myself somebody that loves reading and is obsessed with books and freaks out about books, and I have the biggest book collection ever. I had like 30 books at the beginning of my sophomore year of high school, and now I think I'm at an upwards of like 400 books, so that's only like 2 years ago, 2-ish and a half years ago, and I have so many more books. I've probably spent so much money on books. Oh my god. I truly can't thank my English teacher enough for getting me to this place. I feel like without her, I wouldn't have become this much of a reader. So for that, I am forever grateful. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have an interesting how you became a reader story or how you got into reading story, I would love to hear it. If it was similar to mine, if it was the opposite, if you were one of those kids that was like 5 years old reading Harry Potter, let me know. I would love to hear all about it down below. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. If you want to hear more like story time type videos like this or kind of similar stories like this, then definitely let me know in a comment down below. If you did enjoy this one though, make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you have not already. You can follow me on all my social medias linked down below, but other than that, I hope you guys are having an absolutely wonderful day, and I'll talk to you all in my next video. Bye!